These are strategic principles pulled from two books that were banned by the very institutions that employed their authors. One written by a Florentine diplomat who was tortured in a prison cell, the other by a Spanish Jesuit priest who had his pen, ink, and paper physically taken from him as punishment for writing it. The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli came out in 1532, and The Art of Worldly Wisdom by Baltasar Gracián followed in 1647, a full century later, written in a different country by a man who never read Machiavelli, and yet both arrived at nearly identical conclusions about how power, perception, and human attention actually operate. That's what this video is about. How to become impossible to ignore, not by chasing attention, but by building the conditions that make people unable to stop thinking about you. And we're going to do it using their framework, the neuroscience that confirms it, and the celebrities who are running this playbook right now, whether they know it or not. Section 1. The Men. Born in Florence in 1469, Machiavelli spent 14 years as a diplomatic strategist for the Florentine Republic, negotiating with kings and warlords, personally meeting Cesare Borgia, watching power move at close range. When the Medici family returned to power in 1512, they dismissed him, arrested him, and had him tortured using a technique called the strappado. Arms tied behind the back, body hoisted into the air, then dropped 6 times, joints pulling from their sockets on the way down. He didn't break, and when they finally released him and exiled him to a farm outside Florence, he spent his time writing The Prince as a gift, a calculated attempt to win back the career they'd taken from him. The Medici ignored it completely, but Napoleon read it, Stalin read it, and Kissinger and Nixon reportedly kept it as bedtime reading. The Catholic Church placed it on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official list of books forbidden to Catholics, in 1559, which did nothing to stop it from moving through 7 Italian editions in its first 20 years. What most people don't know is that The Prince was never Machiavelli's full picture. He also wrote a companion work called The Discourses on Livy, completed around 1517, in which he argued at length that republican government was actually superior to princely rule, and that a free people were wiser and more constant than any single ruler. Scholars have debated for centuries how the same man could write both, and the answer seems to be that The Prince was a manual for a specific crisis, a desperate tactical document written for a desperate tactical moment. The Discourses was what he actually believed. Both books were banned by the church. Both books shaped how power has been understood ever since. Baltasar Gracián arrived on January 8, 1601, in Belmonte, Spain, and joined the Jesuits, where his superiors found him both brilliant and infuriating in equal measure. Publishing under pseudonyms wasn't enough to protect him, and when the order finally moved against him, the punishment was thorough. His quarters searched, his pen, ink, and paper confiscated, his academic post stripped away, his right to preach revoked, and his request to simply leave the order refused outright. He died on December 6, 1658, with his health broken, and decades later Schopenhauer translated his work into German and called it one of the finest books ever written. Nietzsche studied it closely. A 1992 English translation spent 18 weeks on the Washington Post bestseller list. Neither man got what he wanted in his own lifetime, and that tension is worth sitting with before we get into what they actually wrote. Section 2. Correction is the only reality that matters. Machiavelli puts it plainly in chapter 18. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. Everybody sees you, and almost nobody actually knows you, which means the gap between what you are and what you appear to be isn't a vulnerability. That gap is the primary variable you get to control. Writing 115 years later, and with no knowledge of Machiavelli, Gracián landed in the same place. Things pass for what they seem, not for what they are. Only rarely do people look into them, and many are satisfied with appearances. Two men, separated by a century and an entire country, reaching the same conclusion. And that convergence isn't coincidence, it's the permanent structure of how human beings process other human beings. The modern demonstration of this principle is Beyoncé, and the numbers are worth paying attention to. Around 2013 and 2014, according to the New York Times, she stopped giving face-to-face interviews entirely, and when Vogue put her on its September 2015 cover, the most important issue in the fashion calendar, she gave no interview at all, with the magazine running an essay by Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Margot Jefferson instead. Yale professor Daphne A. Brooks described what Beyoncé had achieved as hyper-visibility and inaccessibility simultaneously, which is a precise description of Machiavelli's observation applied to a 21st century career. And when she released her self-titled album in December 2013 with zero prior warning and no marketing campaign, it became the fastest-selling album in iTunes history, moving 617,000 copies in the United States alone in the first 3 days. She didn't disappear, she controlled access, and the less people could verify about her, the more powerful the appearance became. Gracián sharpens this into one of his cleanest observations. Many praise a thing without being able to tell why if asked. The reason is that they venerate the unknown as a mystery and praise it because they hear it praised. People don't form opinions from evidence, they form them from other opinions, and they reserve their deepest respect for what they cannot fully explain. Section 3. Build on yourself, not on goodwill. Chapter 6 of The Prince introduces the tension between virtù and fortuna, and it's worth knowing that fortuna wasn't just a metaphor for Machiavelli. Fortuna was a real Roman goddess, depicted in classical art spinning a great wheel, randomly raising some people to the top while sending others crashing to the bottom. Her wheel never stopped turning, and her defining quality was that she answered to no one. Machiavelli borrowed her directly from Roman mythology to name the force that makes all borrowed power so dangerous. She gives, and she takes back, and she tells you nothing in advance. Virtù is the opposite. Mastery, the internal capacity you've developed and own. Men who build on virtù, Machiavelli argues, gain their position with difficulty and hold it with ease, while those who build on fortuna arrive easily and spend every day afterward maintaining a foundation that was never truly theirs. Gracián adds the tactical layer. Keep the extent of your abilities unknown. He allows you to know them but not to comprehend them. For guesses and doubts about the extent of his talents arouse more veneration than accurate knowledge of them, be they ever so great. The combination of those two ideas is where the real architecture lives, genuinely capable, and simultaneously, no one can fully measure the depth of that capability. They sense it without being able to calculate it, and that gap is what creates the pull. Now consider what happened to Kanye West. And to be clear, this is purely the structural business story. By 2021, Forbes estimated the Yeezy partnership with Adidas was worth 1.5 billion of his net worth, meaning that single relationship sat underneath almost everything. And when Adidas terminated the deal in October 2022, Forbes recalculated his net worth from approximately $2 billion down to roughly $400 million, almost overnight. Balenciaga cut ties. Gap ended their collaboration. What Machiavelli described as building on the goodwill of others had made the position permanently exposed, and the moment the goodwill shifted, the foundation went with it. Fortuna's wheel turned. The warning here has nothing to do with celebrity. It's about what your power is actually resting on at any given moment. Section 4. The Neuroscience. Why the brain cannot ignore the unpredictable. In the 1950s, B.F. Skinner was running behavioral experiments with animals and a lever, and what he found split into 3 clean outcomes. Consistent reward produced moderate behavior, no reward produced nothing, and unpredictable reward produced obsession, with animals pressing the lever far more intensely and persistently than when the food appeared every single time. Skinner gave this a name: a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, the specific pattern where rewards come after an unpredictable number of responses, with no way to know when the next one will arrive. It is the same schedule that runs inside every slot machine ever built, and behavioral science has confirmed it as the most powerful motivator in the literature. Not the largest reward, not the most consistent one, but the one you cannot predict. The neurological explanation runs through dopamine, and here the research gets precise. In 1997, neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz published landmark findings in Science, showing that dopamine neurons don't spike when a reward arrives. They spike in anticipation of one. What Schultz identified and named the reward prediction error is the difference between what the brain expected and what actually happened, and it's this gap that drives the dopamine signal. A fully predicted reward generates almost no dopamine response because the brain already accounted for it. An unpredicted reward generates a strong one, and a predicted reward that fails to arrive generates a depression in the signal. The brain registers the absence as a loss. Predictability flattens the entire system. Unpredictability keeps it permanently activated. When someone's presence toward you is warm and consistent and constant, the brain adapts, files the pattern, and stops generating the signal. You become background. But when the attention shifts without a readable pattern, the brain can't close the loop, keeps returning to the question involuntarily, and builds attachment around the anticipation itself. Psychologists have a name for where this mechanism leads in its most intense form. Trauma bonding describes the powerful emotional attachment that forms when intermittent reinforcement, cycles of warmth and withdrawal, presence and absence, reward and its removal, operates over time in a relationship. The term was developed by psychologists Donald Dutton and Susan Painter in the 1980s to explain why people in abusive relationships often feel a stronger bond to their abuser than to anyone who treats them consistently well. The brain's dopamine system, wired to respond most powerfully to unpredictable reward, generates its strongest attachments not to what is reliable, but to what is uncertain. This is not a theory. It is a documented neurobiological mechanism that operates whether the relationship is harmful or not. Gracián described this architecture in 1647 without the neuroscience to explain it. The wise man would rather see men needing him than thanking him. To keep them on the threshold of hope is diplomatic. To trust to their gratitude boorish. Hope has a good memory, gratitude a bad one. The person who has received everything from you has no reason to think about you between interactions, but the person still waiting, still anticipating, carries you with them constantly because you live in the space between what they have and what they still want. Section 5. Decisiveness, Timing, and the Borgia Case Study. Machiavelli devotes most of Chapter 7 to Cesare Borgia, a man he personally observed during his diplomatic missions. He was at Borgia's court from October 1502 through January 1503, sending regular dispatches back to Florence. And the reason he holds him up as a case study is that Borgia demonstrated something nearly impossible to teach in the abstract: the precise combination of timing and total commitment. When Borgia's enemies, the Orsini family and associated factions, were conspiring against him, his response wasn't defensive maneuvering. It was an invitation to Senegalia, sent with gifts and warm words, and when they arrived, he had them strangled. Machiavelli was present during this period, and discussed it directly with Borgia afterward. What he analyzes is not the morality of the act, but the structural logic. Decisive, timed precisely. No half measures, no prolonged conflict giving opponents time to regroup. Borgia also installed an enforcer named Ramiro de Orco, a Spanish military commander who had been in Borgia's service since at least 1498. As governor of Romagna, a region in chaos, Ramiro governed from October 1501 through December 1502, and his approach to restoring order was relentless. Public executions, torture, heavy fines on entire cities. The region was pacified. The people feared him, and on December 26, 1502, Ramiro was arrested, given a summary trial, convicted of corruption, and executed in the main plaza of Cesena, his body cut in two and his head mounted on a pike. Borgia had not been present for the execution. He departed Cesena immediately afterward. The people were simultaneously satisfied and stunned, and Borgia had managed to absorb the benefit of restored order while distancing himself from the cruelty that produced it. The method disappeared, the outcome stayed. Gracián understood this architecture. See that things end well. The world does not notice the details of the measures employed, but only the good or ill result. The Elon Musk and Twitter acquisition follows the same structural pattern, and this observation carries no endorsement of the decisions involved. In April 2022 came the unsolicited $44 billion offer, followed in May by Musk declaring the deal temporarily on hold, followed in July by his attempt to terminate it entirely over fake account disputes, followed by Twitter's lawsuit to force completion, followed by months of genuine suspense about the outcome. And then, on the final day before the Delaware court trial deadline, he closed the deal, walked into Twitter's offices carrying a sink, fired the CEO and several top executives on the spot, and eliminated roughly half the workforce within days. Nothing gradual, nothing telegraphed. The world couldn't look away for months, and that sustained cognitive demand wasn't accidental. It was the product of total unpredictability held right up until the moment of decisive, complete action. Section 6. Fear versus love. Control what you control. Chapter 17 contains the line most people think they know. It would be best to be both loved and feared. But since the two rarely come together, anyone compelled to choose will find greater security in being feared than in being loved. The reasoning behind it is what most people skip. Love holds through obligation, and obligation breaks the moment breaking it serves someone's interest. Fear holds through the anticipation of consequence, which doesn't leave the mind as easily. His conclusion draws the line clearly. Since men love as they themselves determine, but fear as their ruler determines, a wise prince must rely upon what he and not others can control. None of that is about instilling terror. It's about recognizing which variable you actually hold. When your self-possession appears contingent on someone else's approval, they feel it, and they often pull back from giving you the thing you're visibly reaching for because visible need reduces the value of what's being needed. When you appear equally intact, whether their approval comes or not, the dynamic shifts, and now they're the uncertain party trying to read you. Beyoncé's response to what the press called Elevator Gate makes this concrete. In May 2014, surveillance footage leaked showing her sister Solange physically attacking Jay-Z in a hotel elevator following the Met Gala, and within days the speculation about her marriage had gone global. The family's response was complete silence for months, and then nearly 2 years later, in April 2016, she released Lemonade, an hour-long visual album on HBO dealing directly with infidelity, betrayal, and the decision to stay. She didn't answer the narrative that was circulating about her. She waited and then released her version of events in her format, at her moment, at a scale no interview or press statement could have matched. Gracián put the principle in a single line: a resolution declared is never highly thought of, it only leaves room for criticism. Section 7. The Fox and the Lion. Chapter 18 gives us the framework. It is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares and a lion to terrify the wolves. The lion gets overwhelmed by traps it didn't see coming, and the fox gets torn apart by wolves it can't overpower alone. But combined, each one covers what the other lacks, and the alternation between them is what creates something a single mode never could, which is genuine unpredictability. The person you cannot categorize generates a constant low-level cognitive demand because you haven't finished solving them. And the variable ratio reinforcement schedule from the previous section runs underneath that demand continuously. Your brain keeps pulling the lever because it has learned, on some level, that the reward sometimes comes. Gracián adds the part Machiavelli leaves implicit. Use, but do not abuse, cunning. Everything artificial should be concealed, most of all cunning, which is hated. It arouses distrust. The strategy has to read as character, because the moment someone sees the calculation, they've solved the pattern, and a solved pattern can be predicted, and a predictable person gets filed away. The fox has to look like a lion doing what comes naturally, which is the more difficult discipline of the two. Section 8. The two failure modes. Chapter 19 names the two conditions that destroy influence, and they operate through entirely different mechanisms. Hatred comes from taking what people consider theirs, their property, their dignity, the things they've organized their identity around, and that kind of violation doesn't fade over time the way other resentments do. Contempt comes from weakness, being fickle, irresolute, unable to commit to a decision and stand behind it. One gets you despised for being dangerous in the wrong direction, the other gets you despised for being small. He who is highly esteemed, Machiavelli writes, is not easily conspired against. Chapter 8 draws the further distinction between cruelty well used, front-loaded, purposeful, transitioning quickly into order so that people can orient around it, and cruelty poorly used, which escalates without purpose and generates not fear but contempt, and then hatred, and then the collective response that follows both of those things together. Kanye's trajectory maps onto that distinction directly. From roughly 2013 to 2018, he occupied a position of genuine awe, unpredictable, powerful, impossible to categorize, and then the provocations became more frequent, more extreme, and stopped producing any visible transition toward order or stability. Adidas terminated in October 2022, Balenciaga cut ties, Gap ended their collaboration. What Machiavelli identifies as the organized response of a population that is both hating and despising simultaneously had arrived, not through external enemies, but through the crossing of the specific thresholds the chapter names. The principle isn't about being universally liked, it's about staying above two lines at once, and everything else stays open. Section 9. Delegate the unpleasant. Own the gracious. Late in chapter 19, Machiavelli states it plainly. Princes ought to leave affairs of reproach to the management of others, and keep those of grace in their own hands. People don't primarily store memories of what happened. They store memories of how it felt and who they were looking at when it happened. Which means the association your name builds over time is something you can shape deliberately by being selective about where your visible presence appears. Gracián sharpens the application. Do good a little at a time, but often. There is a great subtlety in giving what costs little yet is much desired, so that it is esteemed the more. A sustained flood of generosity becomes expected, and expected things stop generating any response worth having. Small, well-timed, unpredictable moments of genuine recognition land harder than large, consistent ones. For the same reason, the slot machine beats the vending machine. The variable ratio reinforcement schedule and the reward prediction error it produces is most powerful precisely when the reward cannot be anticipated. Beyoncé's engagement pattern runs on this architecture. Each social media post lands as an event precisely because they aren't constant, and each rare public statement carries weight because statements aren't routine. The engagement never stops, but it also never becomes predictable enough to stop triggering the anticipation response. Your presence is a finite resource, and attaching it deliberately is less about strategy than about understanding what presence actually does to the people receiving it. Two men, a century apart, both punished for writing honestly about how power moves, both ignored by the very people they most wanted to reach, both read obsessively by the people who went on to shape the world around them. The system they built, taken together, comes down to this: build on yourself rather than on anyone else's goodwill, because goodwill is Fortuna's gift, and Fortuna's wheel keeps turning. Never fully reveal the depth of what you've built, because what can be completely measured loses the capacity to generate wonder. Act completely when action is required, because half measures signal irresolution, which is the quality that produces contempt. Be unpredictable in your warmth. The variable ratio reinforcement schedule, confirmed by Schultz's dopamine research and documented in the trauma bonding literature, makes intermittent recognition the most neurologically adhesive force the brain produces. Alternate between fox and lion, because the person who can be categorized can be predicted, and the person who can be predicted becomes invisible. Keep people on the threshold of hope, because hope has a good memory, and the anticipation of what they haven't yet received is what keeps your name circulating in their thoughts. And never take what people consider theirs. Machiavelli was tortured, exiled, and dismissed by the prince he built his gift around. Gracián had his pen confiscated and died out of favor. Neither man successfully ran his own system at the moments that mattered most to him personally. And that fact doesn't weaken the argument. It sits at the center of it. 500 years later, we're still talking about them, and that might be the most Gracián thing either of them ever did.